And welcome to this week's IG Live. Today we are going to be talking to my friend Wakanyi Hoffman, who is an author and a storyteller, and she's going to be telling us all about her children's book, which is passing on ancient African indigenous wisdom. And we're going to talk about why that is important in our modern lives today, what this so important to pass on values, these universal values that we can pass on to children. And again, why it's still relevant today. Hello.
Hi.
So good to see you.
It's so lovely to you again. Thank you so
Yes, for those that don't know, I got to do an interview with Wakanyi. I think that was more than a year ago, maybe a year and a half ago on Read Your World. And today I get the pleasure of talking to her because she has a new book that has come out, which is so exciting. So welcome. Tell us all about it. Well, maybe let's back up first because I do want to get to that. But if you could introduce yourself and then tell us what was your journey to becoming an author and a storyteller.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me, and welcome to everyone that's watching this. Thank you so much for joining us. And thank you, Liana and Makeaway Media, for creating this space so we can discuss children's books. So my name is Wakanyi Hoffman. I'm an author, storyteller, researcher, and I really focus my attention on indigenous storytelling, especially from Africa. So my journey to becoming a storyteller, I would actually say that probably that was something I inherited from my grandmothers, but actually becoming one was really inspired by my own child. So I grew up on the edge of a forest, which is an indigenous forest full of indigenous trees. And I've learned that it's the only forest with indigenous trees in any capital city in the world. So this is pretty interesting thing to learn. But yeah, so I grew up there, and my little primary school was actually in the middle of the forest. So I had to walk to school every day and back. And through that journey, we would then walk through the forest and back. And I think that's where the storyteller emerged. You know, I'd tell so many stories, or I'd observe different animals, different species of plants and trees. And that just, you know, that creates this wonderful imagination in a little child. And so I naturally gravitated to telling stories to make meaning out of the experience that I was having. And then it wasn't really, and that was the unconscious storyteller in me. But the conscious storyteller came about when I had my first child as a mom. And here I was living as an expat spouse. My husband was working for the UN, so we were traveling and living in different parts of the world. And when my daughter, my firstborn, went to school, I would go and pick her up from the library, and there would browse through the shelves and realize that there were no books written by Africans, no stories really, none of the stories that I grew up with. So here were all these wonderful stories, and no offense to any author, I love children's books, but there were none that could really capture my own childhood. So then I started telling these stories to my kids, and then I realized that, you know, there needed to be created some space for African storytelling. So I decided to come up with this idea of the African Folktales Project, which is how really I became a formal storyteller. So I started collecting African stories, and that's how I formalized that whole process and started publishing some of the folktales. And that led to Sala.
So tell us about Sala.
Right, so Sala is inspired by the Samburu indigenous community, which are, the Samburu people are one of the last indigenous people in Kenya and possibly in the world. You know, they're a very small marginalized community, they're pastoralists, they're semi-nomadic, so they move from place to place, but really within the same region. Very arid part of Kenya, very difficult, harsh conditions. And they've kind of stayed in that place and retained their practices, their cultural practices and ideas there. And it's beautiful to watch. But one of the disturbing, I guess one would say, cultural aspect of the Samburu is how they perceive of girls. You know, to this, it's still very much idea that girls are, you know, property, really. Like they should be bred to become someone's wife, you know. So there's a very concerted effort to try and resolve this, but it really interferes with the cultural value. So I wanted to write a book that would somehow flip the narrative a little bit and help lean into this culture and sort of bring out the bravery, the courage that a young Samburu girl can have to be able to step out of that narrative, own her own story. And this was really during the coronavirus. I was sitting there watching my kids doing the whole online school. I'm sure the parents watching this can resonate and commiserate with me. So I was sitting by the dining table, which is where my kids were having their class, or their various classrooms. And I realized that they had this privilege, my kids had this privilege to be in front of the iPads. Even though we didn't enjoy that, it was still a privilege to be able to go to school virtually. Whereas here you've got kids in Samburu land, especially the girls, well, they were all out of school. But what was happening, the news coming out of those kinds of places, which was very limited, you had to really find out from people out there, is that the girls were now going off to get married or getting pregnant. And that was just, you know, amplified during coronavirus. And to me, I just thought, I remembered myself as a little girl growing up and how much I enjoyed just the joy of the freedom of exploring. And I thought, that's what they should be doing. They've got this beautiful part of the world that they occupy. They should be out there learning from their grandmothers. And here the fear, the worry of a young Samburu girl is to be married off and never go back to school. So this is how sort of the story of Sala came alive. And I remember just how much I enjoyed spending so much time with my grandmothers and listening to them, and then, you know, teach me some of their ways or listening to their stories. And I realized that there's this aspect of African storytelling that is really untapped. This idea that grandmothers as wisdom keepers are really also the teachers. They teach through storytelling. And I really wanted to bring back this grandmother voice into children's books in a way that is relevant and not just a figure on the side or a member of the extended family, but actually as a central figure in the knowledge and in the way that children learn, which is really through stories. So that's how the story of Sala came alive.
I love that. And it's so amazing. What's amazing to me is that you're bringing back this traditional storytelling through the grandmother, and yet you're also bringing about kind of a modern sensibility. I mean, like here, this girl, as she's being empowered to kind of break the gender barriers that she's grown up with, and yet it's not completely, I mean, it's still, like you said, you're still leaning into a lot of the cultural values and kind of preserving the traditions that are good to preserve. I mean, was that kind of a tricky balance of trying to find out, okay, how do we continue some of these traditions and yet also empower them to feel like they can change what needs to be changed?
Oh, for sure. And that's still a struggle. You know, as somebody who advocates for Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous people's stories and cultures, at the same time, I want to remove that exoticism that we have around Indigenous people and really just humanize them, show the positives as well as the bits of their cultures that need to be improved, which is really all of us when you really think about it. So yes, there was a real challenge there. And you know, one of the cultures of Indigenous Samburu people is to put beads around their girls at a certain age. This is sort of a ceremonial thing to show your peer group or your age or your marriageable age and that sort of thing. And so there's a twist in the story where then the beads become Sala's story of conquering this mountain. So I wanted her to actually have her own story become different to what the beads around her waist would represent, rather than represent ownership, right? She's owned by someone else. I wanted her to own herself. And then through that, you know, kind of create this idea of, look, I can tell my own story as well. And as I can, at the same time, I can retain this culture of having beads and, you know, that whole story. So I really struggled to try and find the sort of balance in between. But I think that we can all relate to storytelling as a way to empower someone to tell their own narrative. And that's something that is universal. And I would hope that I did justice to the Samburu culture of using beads to tell stories.
It is such an empowering book. I mean, such an empowering story. What do you hope that children take away from it when they read it?
Well, I think courage. Um, there's a lot of fear, I feel, amongst parents around what will our kids become. We've got artificial intelligence, we've got a lot of stuff to worry about as moms and dads and as parents in general. And I mean, I look at my own kids and I think that there is this general desire to be whoever they want to be, but we impose a lot of stories, good and bad, without actually paying attention to what the stories that the children are actually telling themselves about who they are. So in this book, I would just want boys and girls to really have the courage to speak up and say what it is that they're thinking, and to be encouraged to say it all, just the whole array of human conditions and human emotions. Because I have this feeling that, with courage, it's kind of the counter to the fear that parents have. So if kids can show a little bit of courage, then maybe that would reduce the fear that parents have. And then we can all just be brave enough to follow this path of becoming human, becoming better at being human. So that's kind of the goal. I would just want to see kids just being able to say whatever it is that they're thinking about without worrying about whether that's a good enough story, or is that going to fly with my mom and dad or my teacher. But just really having that courage, and then bravery being sort of the energy that amplifies or calls to action. So yeah, courage is the thing.
I think that's so beautiful because I think it's true. I mean, I can definitely relate to having that fear as a parent and to having my kids be the ones a lot of times who are leading the way as far as, you know, making sure I'm living up to my values and doing what I say, matching that my words are matching my actions. They're a lot of times the ones who push us. And like you say, that they often have more courage than we do about that. So that's wonderful that this book is kind of, like you said, empowering them to kind of drive the whole family and help the whole family walk this path together. And speaking of family, as you mentioned, a key figure in the book is the grandmother, who is the one who's passing on this wisdom. And I'm curious, because we do live in such a fast-paced modern world, why does this kind of, ancient wisdom, what role does it still have to play in our lives?
Oh, a lot. I think that we have a lot of rules in society, as with any society at any given time. We make up rules and we make up all these agreements and we decide how we want to live. But our values are timeless. So to me, ancient African wisdom is timelessness. It's the values of our common humanity. And I talk about it in terms of Ubuntu, I talk about it in terms of, global oneness or wholeness. I think that's what we can tap into when we start to look at ancient traditions of any kind, right? You can go as far back as traditions in the Far East, traditions in any part of the world, but indigenous people in general have retained a certain quality of human values that we can all relate to. So I think ancient wisdom the word ancient perhaps is probably the wrong, I haven't come up with a new vocabulary to define what we mean by ancient, but it isn't ancient. It's timeless. It's timeless. I think that's what it is. So, and to bring that, to amplify it into the space that we're in, and I know I keep talking about artificial intelligence, but I think that there's a kind of wisdom lacking within this space that we're occupying, within this new world that we're building. And maybe that's that timeless ancient wisdom that needs to be brought forward, because it hasn't remained dated in a place. Indigenous people have been doing what they've always been doing. They've been passing down wisdom based on their experience. So the experience of an Indigenous person today is very different to the experience of an Indigenous person 7 generations ago. So that timeless wisdom has evolved, and they've innovated in ways that we don't even know because they're not part of the mainstream world. So how about we bring that knowledge into where knowledge is being shared, and see that there are certain qualities of our humankind that is common to all of us. And indigenous people, ancient wisdom can lead the way within that space that we're occupying now with new knowledge coming up.
Yeah, can you talk a little bit more about that? What are some of those universal values that you think we can get from that timeless wisdom?
Well, the values of mirroring each other's ideas, the value of reciprocity, you know, just the idea that giving and receiving is not a competitive process. I talk about you know, indigenous people have a quality to the way that they live that is not competitive. It's more an aspiration to become competent at something. So there is this desire to achieve your highest potential without necessarily discrediting someone else's potential, right? So I think that's a common value that we can bring into the space that we're occupying that can maybe counter this hyper competitiveness that's actually taken over our world, which, you know, competition is great, but it's not good if people are being left behind. So how about we start looking at competence versus competition? How about looking at interconnectedness versus individuality? And then maybe we might come to a point where your greatest potential as Liana and my greatest potential as Wakanyi can now come together and collaborate to find a solution. So there's a lot of collaboration that comes out of this idea of non-competitive mindset and more collaborative mindset. So I think that's a real big part of indigenous wisdom and knowledge, or ancient wisdom, that can really come into our space as modern humanity. And that's a value, that's a quality of being human that perhaps we need to really amplify in the spaces that we're occupying.
Could you talk more about, you had mentioned Ubuntu. Can you tell us more about that? I know you said it's not what you do, it's who you are. What exactly is it, and how is it relevant today?
Ubuntu has become a bit of a buzzword, and I'm actually struggling to really communicate that in a universal way, although it is very much an African original philosophy of being, but it is really a universal idea about who we are as human beings. And these are not my words. Ubuntu originated from Southern Africa, right? So that's kind of the home of Ubuntu. And really they are the mothers and fathers of Ubuntu. And the idea is that as you encounter another human being, you really are connected at that human to human level, first and foremost. So it is this sort of universal acknowledging of who each other is before you can relate at the differences. So instead of looking at the differences that you have, you actually find the commonality, which is that we're both human beings. And then after that, you can start to deal with, you know, so it kind of naturalizes or neutralizes the space so that there is no difference between you and I. There is no competition between you and me. And a great example of Ubuntu is a very unique friendship that was between the late Desmond Tutu, Archbishop Desmond Tutu of South Africa, and the Dalai Lama. The two of them were an amazing example of how far you can go with this concept of Ubuntu. Now, Desmond Tutu talked a lot about Ubuntu throughout his entire career. And at the end of his days, you know, the last final days of his life, one of the things that the Dalai Lama said was that when he passes away, he would love to have that face be the last face that he sees. That's the quality of their friendship. That is how far they went. They were so in tune with each other. And these two personalities couldn't have been from farther apart. You know, their worlds are so different. Their ideologies are so different. Their religious ideas are so different. Their spiritual upbringing is so different. So I think that, to me, that is an example of what exactly Ubuntu is. It's sort of, you bypass every kind of identity that you can come up with, every definition of who you are, and you go back to the base level, which is that I am human and you're human, and my humanity is intricately tied up in yours. So I can't call myself a human being if I am not acknowledging your own quality as a human being. So there is this dance that you do when you're mirroring each other's values. And of course, there's a negative side to it, which is that we could be mirroring the wrong values, right? But in essence, the idea is to figure out yourself and the other person figures out themselves, and then you're able to see each other for who you really are. And so there's no games of blaming and sort of competing for the same things. You're competing for quality connection. You're competing for ideas that can connect you rather than differences that can set you apart. So that to me is what Ubuntu is.
And that sounds like exactly the kind of value that we need today. and I just want to warn people, if you try to Google it, be aware, as I found out, it also apparently now is the name of some kind of computer system. So you might have to dig a little bit deeper. But that is really beautiful. And I love how you're bringing these values to the forefront and especially putting them in book form to pass on to children. Before we go, can you remind us, how can people connect with you and how do they get a copy of your new book?
So the new book is available all around the world. So it's available on Amazon. I think it will be in the US in January on. So it's not yet there. So it's not yet available in the US, but it's available in other places. And it is available in the Autobari, the publisher's bookstore, online bookstore. So you can order from there. And you can connect with me on Instagram. You can connect with me on Facebook at Wakanyi Hoffman. And yeah, you can send me an email. I think my email address is somewhere there as well. Yeah, I'd be happy to continue this conversation with anyone that is interested in learning more about Ubuntu or storytelling, especially educators. I have a very soft spot for teachers, and I think that teachers are our first storytellers. They've kind of replaced the storytellers that we had, which were the grandmothers. And so if any educators want to get in touch with me and learn about how to use storytelling as really a pedagogical approach to learning in the classroom, I'd love to come on board and read stories to any classroom.
Oh, what a wonderful gift. And I should also mention that Wakanyi and I will be talking on multicultural kid blogs. I don't have the date in my mind, but it's coming up very soon. So watch for that announcement as well. And thank you so much for joining us. It's always so great to talk with you. And I'm so excited about your book.
Thank you so much for having me. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, Liana. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Bye.